King 5 in Seattle, Gene Henderson and Mike James, with Jeff Renner weather and Tony Ventrella sports. This is King 5 News.
Good afternoon again. Mike James has his day off.
Live from Seattle, this is King 5 News with David Curley, Joyce Taylor, Lou Gellis, and Rich Marion.
Good afternoon.
Live from Seattle, this is King 5 News with Gene Henderson, Mike James, Tony Ventrella, and Jeff Renner. This is the 6 o'clock report.
Again, good evening.
Live from Seattle, this is the Northwest's most watched late night newscast with Don Porter, Jeff Renner weather, and Tony Ventrella sports. This is King 5 News.
Good evening.
Number 1 at 5 o'clock, King 5 Television. And now, with all the news for Western Washington, Gene Henderson and Barry Judd, meteorologist Jeff Renner, and Tony Ventrella sports. This is King 5 News. Number 1 at 11. This is King 5 Television. And now, with all the news for Western Washington, Gene Henderson and Barry Judd, meteorologist Jeff Renner, and Tony Ventrella sports. This is King 5 News at 11.
Our top story tonight, fire investigators believe they know what caused an apartment blaze in Kent.
When news happens, you'll see it happen on King 5. And now, with all the news for Western Washington, Gene Henderson and Mike James, Shelley Monahan's weather, and Tony Ventrella sports. This is King 5 News at 11.
The snow at first, a relief to flood victims, is now.
Number 1 at 11, King 5 Television. And now, with all the news for Western Washington, Lori Matsukawa and David Curley, with Shelley Monahan weather and Carlos Del Valle sports. This is King 5 News at 11.
Number 1 in the Northwest, you're watching King 5 News. Coverage you can count on. With all the news for Western Washington, today's top story, and first alert weather. And now, King 5 News at 6:30.
Marching for a cause.
Number 1 in Western Washington, with coverage you can count on. Broadcasting in HD TV from Digital Studio A. King 5 Morning News. Number 1 in Western Washington, with coverage you can count on. Broadcasting in HD TV from Digital Studio A. King 5 News at 5.
All day, police and SWAT.
You're watching King 5 News at 5. With Gene Henderson, Dennis Bounds, Jeff Renner's First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie's Sports. Number 1 at 5. With coverage you can count on. King 5 News at 5.
A Seattle neighborhood is under siege tonight.
Number 1 at 6:30, King 5 News starts now.
November is sure going out with a blast of winter. Tonight, the...
You're watching King 5 News at 6:30 with Gene Henderson, Dennis Bounds, Jeff Renner's First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie's Sports. Number 1 at 6:30 with coverage you can count on. King 5 News at 6:30. Welcome back. You're watching King 5 News at 6:30 with Alan Schaffler, Mimi Chung, Megan Black's First Alert Weather, and Greg Bailey's Sports. Number 1 on the weekend with coverage you can count on. King 5 News at 6:30. Number 1 in Western Washington with coverage you can count on. Broadcasting in HD TV from Digital Studio A. King 5 News at 11.
Our top story, new evidence uncovered as federal agents join the investigation into a fire that severely burned a Seattle toddler.
Number 1 at 11, King 5 News starts now.
There it is, a bright light streaking.
You're watching King 5 News at 11 with Margaret Larson, Dennis Bounds, Jeff Renner's First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie's Sports. Number 1 at 11 with coverage you can count on. King 5 News at 11.
Imagine being so shy you can't go out, you can't make friends, you even have trouble working.
You're watching King 5 News at 11 with Margaret Larson, Dennis Bounds, Jeff Renner's First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie's Sports. Number 1 at 11 with coverage you can count on. King 5 News at 11. You're watching King 5 News at 11 with Mimi Chung, Don Porter, Megan Black's First Alert Weather, and Greg Bailey's Sports. Number 1 on the weekend with coverage you can count on. King 5 News at 11.
King 5 News with all the latest news, weather, and sports. Number 1 in Western Washington, this is King 5 News.
Checking our top stories, a Renton.
Number 1 in the mornings, King 5 News on Kong starts now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mimi Jung. You're watching King 5 News at noon.
Number 1 at noon, King 5 News starts now.
We want peace! We want peace!
As protesters say no to military action against Syria, Congress debates whether or not it will back President Obama's proposal to act.
Number 1 at 5, King 5 News starts now.
Mall shooter unmasked. New information about the gunman who opened fire on holiday shoppers.
King 5 News with Gene Anderson, Dennis Bounds, Jeff Renner First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie Sports. Number 1 in Western Washington, King 5 News at 5.
An avalanche stops traffic on Snoqualmie Pass this afternoon.
King 5 News with Gene Anderson, Dennis Bounds, Jeff Renner First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie Sports. Number 1 in Western Washington, King 5 News at 5.
I want to update you now on the fatal Oregon Mall shooting.
Number 1 at 6:30, King 5 News starts now.
If I were a ferry worker, I would very much want to understand what's going on.
King 5 News with Gene Anderson, Dennis Bounds, Jeff Renner First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie Sports. Number 1 in Western Washington, King 5 News at 6:30.
Last night we took
The only local news at 7 o'clock. King 5 News starts now.
The gun control debate and Starbucks. Why is the corporation receiving so much attention from both sides? Good evening, I'm Mimi Jung.
And I'm Dennis Bounds.
The most watched news in Western Washington. King 5 News at 9 starts now.
Good evening, I'm Rob Piercy, and this is King 5 News at 9 on Kong.
The most watched news in Western Washington. King 5 News starts now.
Tonight, the search is on for this man, a dangerous sex offender who has disappeared somewhere in Western Washington.
Number 1 at 10. King 5 News on Kong starts now.
Good evening. We start with breaking news in Bellevue, where a driver going the wrong way triggers a deadly crash.
King 5 News with Lori Matsukawa, Dennis Bounds, Shannon O'Donnell, First Alert Weather, and Paul Sylvie Sports. The most watched news in Western Washington. King 5 News at 10 on Kong. Number 1 at 11. King 5 News starts now.
Travelers try to get to their Christmas destinations before Santa tonight, and at the same time beat some nasty weather back east that is already scrubbing flights at SeaTac for tomorrow. Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this Christmas Eve. I'm Al.
The most watched news in Western Washington. This is King 5 News.
Good evening. A bitter harvest in Scandal.
You're watching King 5 News.
It was a plea deal that was supposed to help both sides heal.
I'm John Langler in Auburn. Just who was Jonathan Whitehead? Why did he block traffic on the Ship Canal Bridge? What was his behavior before Monday night? We'll tell you what we found.
And this is what a Southwest Washington family is going to wake up to, how they escaped injury when a car barreled through their house.
Next at 11, from books to billions. Amazon made a big announcement today, and tonight we're taking a look at just how far they have come.
You're watching King 5 News.
A troubled man struggling to find work while bouncing from home to home. It is the story of 33-year-old Jonathan Whitehead, identified today as the man killed in Monday's bizarre shootout on the Ship Canal Bridge.